which by now I should know that I should record everything. So good evening on the 10th of December, at the end of an interesting year. So this is the last meetup for 2020. This is the Orlando.NET user group and Orlando Code Camp, and that's kind of the people who bring you this show. It's myself, Tanner, who's not here today, Andy and Tim, they should be on the call. Todd is on the call, and a few others who are probably not on this call right now. The best place to kind of keep tabs of us is on meetup.com/ONETUG. That's for Orlando.NET user group, and the Twitter handle is also ONETUG. So we really went, we did the branding perfect over there. We also on Facebook, Twitch, and other places, but right now it's more on Meetup and Twitter. Just so you know, once this call is over, we will post the recording on our YouTube channel and tweet out the link and put it on the Meetup page. So anyone got any announcements before we move on? Community announcements? Anything special going on? Any events? Any kind of open source projects that people should know about, other than the one Simon was presenting, which he did a great job? No?
I just shared one more of mine. That's something that joins Entity Framework with Fluent Validation.
Mm-hmm.
So it means you can write validate classes for any given model, and it will execute those as part of the save when you actually persist those things. But that's all I got.
Okay. So can you drop a link for that in the chat?
He already put it.
Okay. Yep. You did. Okay, great. So what we'll do is we'll compile a link of all the stuff in the chat, and we'll kind of post it at the end of that day. So tonight's talk is obviously being recorded, and we will upload the video to YouTube. And Jeremy will be talking about what's new in Entity Framework Core 5.0, which even I'm not familiar with. But I know Jeremy for a while. Jeremy used to be a Microsoft MVP, like me. I think that's where we met first, and yes. We used to speak at a lot of events. So we had plenty of opportunities to hang out together. He currently works for Microsoft as senior program manager in the .NET data team. Is it, Jeremy?
That's correct.
Yep. So I think you live in the Pacific Northwest. That's my understanding. I have often seen you post photos of the awesome mountains around there, and I think last year you also had earlier this year I think you had a diagnosis that if you feel like sharing about it, I'm gonna drop off and you can kind of talk more about it, or you can jump into the talk. It's up to you, Jeremy. So thank you for showing up, and thank you for talking to our group. We're really honored to have you. So please take it off from here.
All right, thanks. It is first 100% my pleasure to be here. Let me share while I'm introing. So I've been at Microsoft for 3 years, and the same day I found out about my new role as senior program manager for .NET Data, I was with a team called the Cloud Advocates before that. That same week, I got a diagnosis of young onset Parkinson's disease. So that was a pretty long journey. I saw I think it was 7 different doctors, and they all insisted that I was too young to have Parkinson's. I finally found a specialist who confirmed that. And it was interesting because I remember being concerned with how it might impact my talks, because the main symptom I have is a tremor in my left hand, which is my dominant hand, by the way. So it was impacting my typing and some other things. Fortunately, through medications, catching it early, doing a lot of exercise and things that have been shown to slow progression, my symptoms are pretty much under control. But it is ironic that my concern with how it would impact my presenting came right before, unfortunately, COVID, and everything went on lockdown. So it was kind of an interesting circle. I have a website that's a personal website that is strengthwithparkinsons.com. Strength with Parkinson's. I can drop the link in the chat or whatever. But that's my site where I detail my journey and how I'm working with it. I'm a huge advocate for just raising awareness about it. And, you know, I have a lot of information about things that I found that have worked. So that's sort of my personal backstory. The new role that I went into was this role of .NET Data, which encompasses really all the ways that .NET developers interact with data. But a big part of that is working with the Entity Framework core team. Really great team. They accepted me right off the bat. We had a great synergy. And so I'm excited to be here representing the work of that team. Entity Framework Core 5 is a very major milestone in the history of Entity Framework. There was a huge leap when we transitioned from Entity Framework 6, which was sort of the mature .NET Framework version of this, and then we transitioned to EF Core to establish the cross-platform modern version. That went through some rewrites, some architectural changes, and really there was a gap for a while between what users had come to expect with the full version and what was actually available. And with EF Core 5, most of the major requested features have been implemented. There are still some that are going into our EF Core 6 planning, but a lot of features and functionality, and that's what I'm going to show today. So without further ado, let me step into our agenda for what we're going to walk through. I'm going to demo some new features. I'm going to also demo some new features. I'm going to demo some more and leave some time for questions and answers. So if that sounds good to everyone, we will dive in. And just feel free to ping me if you have any issues with seeing what I'm showing. I'm sharing my Visual Studio Code. Could I just get a thumbs up if the font size looks good for everyone? All right, awesome. So what I'm going to start with is going to serve two purposes. I want to level set on Entity Framework. For some of you on the call who may not be familiar with it, we'll do a very high level of how it works. And I'm also going to show what is built into, sorry, my screen was flashing. What is built into, someone says they still see a PowerPoint, but it's definitely shifted. Let me get one more confirmation here before I see if I need to. I may have accidentally shared my app instead of my, okay, let's do this. Let's share my screen.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that has difficulty sharing in Teams.
Yeah, right. I shared the app instead of the screen. So this should be good. Let me just pop back here so I can see everyone. So what I'm going to start out with is pretty simple. So I've got some C# classes. You can see they're pretty complex classes. You can imagine the size of the unit tests against these. There is a contact, and interestingly enough, I'm storing a name for the contact, and I have a ID, and that contact has some meetings. I also have a meeting that has some attendees. Now, there's nothing special related to EF Core here. These are just C# classes. What is a little bit forced, if you will, is this idea of meeting attendee, which is a join entity that pivots between contacts and meetings. If I was going to purely design this without thinking about the database, I would probably just have a contact with meetings and a meeting with contacts. I wouldn't need this kind of artificial pivot table. Now, in the original Entity Framework Core implementation, this is how you had to model what we call a many-to-many relationship. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. So these are all just C# classes. Where Entity Framework comes in is this thing called the DB context. And I think of this as sort of the facade or the glue between your domain model and your database. This context has two constructors, and this is a pretty common pattern to take in these options so that you can reuse that data context in multiple contexts. So I can use my options to say, over here, I want to use SQL Server. Over there, I want to use some other provider, maybe because I'm supporting multiple databases, or maybe I'm using a different database for testing, for example. There's other things you can do with the options, and we're going to step into that. And then I have this DB set. The DB set is how I tell Entity Framework Core which entities are interesting that it should keep track of. So I may have 500 C# classes. Right now, Entity Framework just cares about contacts and meetings. And because I have these, what we call navigation properties, these collections of attendees, it will infer that that also is important to track as well, because that is on the entity. So that is it. This is all a single, this is, if you look at my project file, this is a .NET 5 app. I'm using C#9, and I'm including a SQLite driver. The reason I'm using SQLite in this demo is simply because it allows me to create a code sample that runs on Linux, Mac, or Windows. I don't have to rely on someone having local DB. So inside of this, I've got the context and everything else. Let's look at some code and see what I'm doing with this. The first thing I'm doing is creating these options, and I'm just telling SQLite, use a local file called meetings.db. That is the simplest connection string I can use with SQLite. If I was using SQL Server, I would pass a SQL Server connection string. I can get that from Key Vault or from environment variables, etc. But I'm configuring it with it, and I'm generating a new context using those options. This part of the code is what we call demo code, right? It's not code that we would use in production. It's an easy way to delete and recreate the database every time I run it, because I want to show you how things change over time. I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, but there's a feature called migrations that is a way of using Entity Framework to manage schema changes and roll database updates. But to keep the demo simple and to focus on kind of the features that changed, I'm not going to get into migrations. There are three fundamental approaches to gluing classes and data together in Entity Framework. There's what we would call database first, which means you're going to model to connect to an existing database. The schema's already been defined. You can do that a couple ways. You can scaffold it. So we have a command line tool that will look at it, suck in the schema, and generate the classes for you. Or you can just build classes that map to it, database first. There's code first, which is what I'm going to show here, defining classes and letting Entity Framework create the database. And then there's what I call kind of in the middle, which is let the database evolve, let the code evolve, and you can use a Fluent API to define the mappings between the two. And those approaches really depend on the history of your database, the size of the database, how you partition code, etc. Here I'm creating my classes. I've got Jeremy, Maria, and Doreen for contacts. I've got these meetings, and then I've got these join entities that are saying basically Maria and Jeremy are in a work meeting, Jeremy and Doreen are in a bank meeting. What's interesting is I don't have to always do the reverse navigation properties. In other words, adding this is enough for it to infer that these contacts should have that collection with them, and these meetings should have those collection with them. So I don't have to do a lot of, new it up here and here just by defining the relationship. When I save these changes, so I'm basically adding all these entities, and notice I can add different entity types in the same call. So these are contacts, these are meetings, these are joins. I'm going to save them. And then here is the very first new feature that comes with Entity Framework. The context is like this unit of work, basically, that keeps track of entities. So if I were to continue writing code from here, the context is aware of these entities that I just seeded the database with. So it's going to track them even after I save the changes. I want to clear that context so that I can have a fresh query, because this query would basically say, hey, I'm the one who created the records, so I don't need to really do much different to pull in all the relationships because I understand them, as opposed to a fresh, let's just get everything from the database. So that's the first thing we added, is there's something called a change tracker in Entity Framework, and it manages all of the changes to your rich object graph. And this is one of the reasons why someone might want to use this over, for example, a SQL data or a direct API, right, to SQL, is that I can have a very complex object graph that is several layers deep, tweak a change, and Entity Framework's going to keep track of that change, and it's going to generate code that only updates what needs to be updated. It will also manage concurrency as well. So this is a query. I'm using language integrated query, and what I'm telling it to do is pull back the context. Now there's three different ways you can load data. You've got eager loading, you've got lazy loading, you've got explicit loading. With eager loading, you're going to pull everything up front. With lazy loading, you're going to tell it to, as you reference properties, it'll generate a proxy and it'll make further calls to fetch the data from the database. That involves installing another package. And then explicit loading says, I'll get the base data and then I'll explicitly go out and request other data as I need it. So this is eager loading. I'm eagerly telling it to include the meetings collection on the contacts. I'm also telling it, if we go back to the class definition, this is just a join right here between contact and meeting. So I'm telling it not only include this meeting attendee, you're pulling it back from the database, but also include the meeting itself. So I want the full depth of the graph. And then I have a where clause. I'm saying where the meeting name is the work meeting. So the goal here is to pull back contacts that are part of the work meeting and then show the contact and the meeting information. So here I've defined the query. This is what we would call an iQueryable. It's a link construct that is the shape of a query. Here we're actually executing the query. Until we iterate on it or call something like toList, it's not going to do anything. It's just building up a definition. This will actually trigger the call, and then we iterate through and show it. So this is a full self-contained app. This is all the code here. And when I press F5, dun, 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 the first test of the evening starts is, can I compile my sample application? Will it run? And we see some code. It spins through, lots of yellow, and here we've got Jeremy, work and bank, and Maria, work. So it did not pull back Doreen because Doreen did not have a work meeting in her collection. She only had the bank meeting. So this is a success. And the other thing I want to show you is what happened is in my folder, this meetings DB got created. So this is the SQLite file. So if I open that using a nice Visual Studio Code extension, I can look at what was generated. And so in my Explorer, I can see meetings DB, there's contacts, there's meeting attendee, and there's meetings. And if I press play, I can see over here, those are my contacts. Over here, those are my meetings. So it created the database, it populated it, sort of gave us everything we need. Let me go ahead and close this. So the first thing I want to show you, well, I say the first thing, I'm probably going to say first thing for everything I show you. We'll say the next thing is something that we call debug view. What debug view does is it provides very explicit insights into the internal workings of Entity Framework Core. Now, the reason why we didn't implement it as a toString, for example, if I look at a query and say query toString, I can get information. But the problem is the debugger automatically calls toString on your entities. And if I'm going through and gathering a lot of information and building up a string just for debug purposes, we don't want that overhead. So the debug view will lazy load information. So unless you access that debug view, it's not going to have the overhead of building up what it's going to show you. So let's go back into the program and set a breakpoint. And there's a reason why I didn't go straight to calling toList. I want to stop right before we make this call. And let me just make sure I'm not jumping ahead. Okay. So let's do this. Let's hit F5 now that we have a breakpoint set. And I'm going to have to do a hack that's a Visual Studio Code hack, and I'll explain why. This will actually just appear in Visual Studio. In Visual Studio Code, if I open my debug pane, we can see I have my local variables here. And I'm just going to scan down to this work contacts query, which is the iQueryable. Here, let me expand this out a little bit. And if I expand this and open it, I get a debug view. And this debug view for this specific thing, because it's a query, it's going to have two things. It's going to have an expression, which is going to basically show all the link that resolved. Now, I wrote everything in one statement, but there's a chance you may have multiple methods building up this big iQueryable, so this sort of summarizes it. But the other part of this is this query, and I'm going to double click this and copy it. Now, the caveat with Visual Studio Code is that it will basically escape some of the information you have because it uses JSON. So if I go back to my database, let me just open this because I want to show you the query here. I can right click on this and say new query, and I'm going to paste what I got. And you can see it's already a little hacked. And again, this will appear fine in Visual Studio. Visual Studio Code, notice it's escaped a few things, like we've got these carriage returns. There's a trick in Visual Studio Code. If I highlight this /r/n and I hit Control F2, it's going to pick all of the /r/n's. So I'm just going to hit Enter, and boom, I've just converted them to an actual carriage return. Then what I'm going to do is take these escaped quotes. I'm going to again hit Control F2, change it to a single quote, and it'll do that for the whole thing. But what I'm seeing here is the actual query that it's going to execute when I pull the trigger on this. And so notice this has a parameter, and I haven't figured out how to use the Visual Studio Code extension to use parameters. So I'm going to go ahead and take that work stuff and just replace this parameter here with the actual literal of work stuff. And we'll right click and run the query. And this is the data that it gets back to populate what we saw. So that's the first enhancement to diagnostics, is being able to use that debug view. Now, the debug view doesn't just exist for queries. What we can do, let me stop this. Let's not save. The reason why I close the database out each time is sometimes it conflicts with the actual app writing to the database. But what I'm going to do is come up here where we're adding things to the context. And I'm just going to do a console.writeLine context change tracker debug view. And notice there's a long view and a short view. So the short view summarizes things. The long view is more explicit, and you'll see what I mean by that. Let's go ahead and do both so we can see the difference. So we're going to add long view and short view. We're going to do the same thing after we save changes. Okay, and then I'll hit F5 to run that. And what we see in the change tracker is the first part of it has the context, the meetings, actually this is probably not the first one. Did I put it in the wrong place? I might have put it in the wrong place because it's showing unchanged. Let me double check. Where did I put this? I put it before the save changes. Oh, I might have been already inside. I don't know. Anyway, what it should have shown is some pretty funky, like negative numbers and everything else, but let's pretend like it's showing what I expect. Basically, what you would see is before you would see that these are added and these are negatives, and then after you would actually see the values that are populated.
Jeremy, you put it before you add it, I think. I think you need to add, put the print lines and then do the save, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, so I put these here. Well, no, see, I put a set here before I save changes. I put a set after. Anyway, neither here nor there. I'm not going to spend too much time troubleshooting it, but what it'll do is basically show you the changes. Now, when you're in Visual Studio, you can have it as a window, and if you've ever had a watch list in Visual Studio, you'll notice that as things change, it highlights it red and shows you, hey, this watch item changed. So you can actually watch the change tracker as you're going through and see what's happening, which is pretty cool. So that's the debug view. The other thing that we did specifically for queries is we placed the extension method called toQueryString. So if I am just interested in what a query definition looks like, I can do this. I can do console writeline work contacts query, and you'll notice that it has this overload to query string. So if I run this, dun, 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 we're going to see basically the same query that we saw in the debug view, but this gives us a way that, for example, if we want to capture it, if we're just interested in the query part, that we can grab that. So there's a few different ways to actually access that. However, on top of all this, maybe instead of debugging, instead of doing toQueryString, I just want to log, right? I have a logging source. I want to grab that information and make it available. Entity Framework Core has always supported logging, but it was through the typical logging implementations you've seen, like an iLogger factory, an iLogger source, and there was a lot of configuration that went into setting it up. And it's a perfectly valid way to do logging, and it's a preferred way because you can tweak your app settings and change the logging levels and everything else. So in production, it makes sense. But if you're in an inner development loop and you're building a new application, you may want just a quick and dirty way to see what's going on. And so the quick and dirty way that we added for EF Core 5 is called log2. And literally all I need to do is come here and say log2, and it's going to ask me what is a action that takes a string basically for the log. So I could have it point to my logging mechanism. Here I'm going to be really easy and just go to console.writeline. I can also specify my log level, so I'm going to do an informational level here. And then if I press F5, we're going to see a lot of new information just from adding that one line of code. And let me expand this and show you what happened in this, again, small, simple program, a lot going on behind the scenes. So this is connecting to the database. It's creating the contacts table. It's creating the meetings table. It's creating meeting attendee. It's adding foreign key constraints. It's creating indexes based on what it understands. It's inserting values into the table. One thing I do want to point out is notice that this is taking parameters. So there's a parameter for the name, and that parameter shows as a question mark. So by default, our logging is going to obfuscate the parameters because that could have sensitive information. You may be passing a password into a database API, and so you don't want that to show up in your logs. However, if I'm doing this locally and I want to be able to just kind of copy and paste these. So for example, for SQL Server, you can literally copy the code, paste it into SQL Server Management Studio and run it to verify it, look at execution plans, everything else. So what I can do in that case is I can tell it I'm good with the extra information. So let's just add this extra option called Enable Sensitive Data Logging. And that will tell it to go ahead and show me what's inside of those parameters. So I'm going to run it one more time. And this time, if we look at the parameters, we can see it's actually showing work stuff, for example, here as the parameter. And if I go up, you'll see other parameters as well. So enable sensitive logging will now show me that data. And there's some other tweaks and nuances, like you can be very specific about the types of information that you want to log, but that is a new simple mechanism for pulling out logs. So let me just close my double tab for program here. Oh, what am I doing? There we go. I did not want a breakpoint there. Just keeping myself honest, add sensitive data. Okay, filtered includes. So there was another feature that we added that I want to show here because it's an interesting behavior. So we've got this context and include meetings and everything else that we ran. If we go to the very end, what it's showing is me as a contact with work stuff and bank meeting, and then Maria with just work stuff. I'm really only concerned with work stuff. I could care less about the personal meeting that I have here, this bank meeting. And so if I want to filter the entities that I'm joining to, we now allow you to do what's called a filtered include. And what I can do inside of this is I can say, and let me see if I have a code snippet to steal first. No, that's okay, because it's pretty intuitive. I can take this here. So this is saying, give me all the contacts that have a work meeting, but then pull back all the information. With the filtered include, it's going to say, even inside the filter, I only want those meetings where the meeting name matches the work meeting. So this is not the same query on the inside. This query is on the contacts, saying, give me the contacts that have at least one work meeting. This query says when you pull back the meetings inside it, only pull back the work meeting. And the difference is when I hit F5, what you'll see at the end of this, we'll look at the query itself and we'll look at the output. Let me expand this out. So notice now we just see work stuff. So it's filtered both the contact and it's filtered the items within the contact. And you can see this query here is now filtering inside this join and doing the any. So you have very fine-grained control over what you're doing. So that's filtered includes. And now let's look at the next one. So a huge point of contention with the implementation of relationships and many-to-many is this artificial join table. I don't want to even have to have this because I'm just doing it to make the database work. How I really want to model my data would look something like this. My contact would just have a collection of meetings like that. And my meeting would just have a collection of contacts like that. So those are the attendees. And really this table, don't care about. Why even have it? Because this is the model that I'm looking for. Now this will require a few changes. Basically here I no longer have this join table, so I need to connect the meetings and the contacts somehow. So what I'm going to do is in this meeting, I'm going to say attendees is a new list of contacts, and that's Jeremy and Maria. So now I've associated those, and I don't have to do the same thing here. I don't have to add the meetings, just one side is fine. Entity Framework is smart enough to figure it out. Here the attendees are a new list, contact, Jeremy, Doreen. And then I get to delete, not only did I delete that meeting attendee class, I get to delete this seed data, which means I get to simplify this and just add the contacts and the meetings. And then here I also simplify my query because I'm not going through this intermediary join. I'm just saying meetings where the meeting name is the work meeting name. I don't need the then include because I don't have to go that deep. And then here I'm doing the same thing with the meeting name. So I just simplified my code quite a bit. And when I'm actually iterating through to show information, I can do it like this and just show the meeting name again. So if I run this, and it's live code, so what could possibly go wrong? Dun, dun, dun. I get the exact same result, meeting and work stuff. So let's see what happened here. First, let's open this database. And expand it. So notice it actually did create a join table called contact meeting that has the join information in it, but I didn't have to explicitly define or configure it. It's all done behind the scenes for me. So this is that new feature with many-to-many, is that it will infer what's needed to join the entities, and it'll create that table behind the scenes. In fact, if you were to parse out all of the SQL that got dumped out in the logs, it would look almost identical to what I had, with the exception that it's given it its own name, which was contact meeting, and that's pretty much it. It's simplified my queries, but the actual query itself is going through the join table. I just don't have to specify it because Entity Framework understands that. Now, what will happen invariably is at some point in time, someone will come along and say, well, we need more context for this. Let me close these out. I don't know what I opened over here. And maybe, for example, with a contact in a meeting, I want to know the status. You know, did I accept the meeting or did I not accept the meeting? So I need context in that join table. I don't necessarily have to make an entity to do that. For example, if I have another system that is populating that data or interfacing with it, I may not want it as part of this model. But what I can do is configure this, and I'm going to show you two things at once with the sample I'm about to show you. I'm going to show you how you can define that join table, but I'm also going to show you a feature of Entity Framework on how it deals with entities that's important to understand. Because at the end of the day, Entity Framework is looking at bags of properties that are going to and from the database. And those properties have relationships, so you can have children and parents and complex relationships. But the whole system's designed so that if you want to map it to a CLR type, you can do that, but you don't have to. You don't even have to have all the properties on it. Like, let's say I have a timestamp property that I'm using for concurrency. That's important for the database, but it's not necessarily important for my code to know that property if Entity Framework's going to handle that for me. So that's what's called a shadow property that we can define and track even though the class itself doesn't have it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to override the definition of the model. Entity Framework basically keeps this internal representation of what the model of the database looks like. I'm telling it the entity that I have called meeting has many attendees. Each attendee has many meetings. And I want you to use an entity to join the two together. I'm going to explicitly configure it. I'm going to call it meeting status. And there's a contact with many meetings. There's a meeting with many contacts. And I also want to have a property on it called accepted, a Boolean property. Now notice that the entity that I'm defining in my generic type is a dictionary. And I can do that. I can map it to a dictionary. As long as I give it a name, I could have every entity be a dictionary property. I can even take the contact definition I have, pull it back as a dictionary, and just look at the properties I'm interested in. So I'm going to take this setup and save that and run it. Let's see first off if it compiles, because then we know it's ready to ship to production. It did compile. So we're going to go live with our code. And at the end of the day, we get the same result here. It's actually joining to meeting status. It really changed the name. But if we look at when it created the table, which is up here, let's see. So meeting status, notice that it created this accepted. And this is saying integer, but in SQLite, that integer will represent the Boolean for it. So the question now is, I've got this dictionary thing. I have the context. There's nothing on the context that actually points to the link table. If we look, like I defined the link table here, but my DB sets are contacts and meetings, how would I ever do anything with that table? So let's say I want to add an entry that basically says Jeremy accepted the work meeting. How would I do that? Well, here's one example of how you can do that. And let me paste this code, and then we will see it in action. So what I'm doing is, after I've added everything, I'm telling the context to give me a set that is typed to just this dictionary. And then I'm telling it, here's the name. And of course you could use a constant or something so you get rid of magic strings. These are just light demos. I can actually use the dictionary properties to build a query. Entity Framework is smart enough to parse that out, turn that into SQL. So what I'm saying is, grab me the bank meeting and the Jeremy attendee, and then take that property bag and set status accepted to true. And then of course I would want to go ahead and save those changes. So let's do this. So let me run that. Dun, dun, dun. Just kidding. All right, so we went through the whole process. Now we're going to open that database again. Meetings DB, meeting status. And if we open this up, now notice that this attendee in this meeting has an accepted status of 1. So that's how flexible the system is, allowing you to configure and define your code. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to specify different types of entities. So in other words, I have a contact, but I may have different types of contacts. So I'm going to come down here where I define my contact, and I'm going to define a special kind of contact called a Microsoft contact. It's going to inherit from contact. And the only interesting piece of information I have on this is an employee ID. And then what I'll do is up here where I define my name, I'm going to change that to a Microsoft contact. And I'm going to set my employee ID to, you didn't think I would give my real one, did you? 1234. Now, if we run this right now, it's really not going to do much at all. It'll recognize that I'm a contact. It'll pull this back. But if we refresh our database definition, we're going to see there's the same tables. And if I look at contacts, there I am. There's no employee ID. I've lost it. That's because I haven't told Entity Framework about the importance of Microsoft Contact. So with older versions of Entity Framework, you could do something like this. You could come inside of the configuration for the model, and you could say, hey, model, let's also look at Microsoft Contact as something interesting to track. So that is functionality that's been there. If I run it now, the end result is going to look the same. We've got Jeremy, work stuff, this and this. But now if we refresh our table definition, we look at contacts, it's added 2 new properties, or columns, I should say, discriminator and employee ID. So if we look at this, it's basically taking all of the different entities that are derived from contact, putting them in the same table, and using this discriminator column to understand how to map them. So we've got employee ID, Doreen's just a regular contact, Maria is, and so employee ID is null. And if we look at the query, it's going to use that discriminator to understand how to map back to the entities. Now this is functionality that existed, and the problem with that is not everyone's tables are defined like this. You may not want a flat table and have everything in that flat table, especially if you have a lot of different specialized types of derived classes. Like you might have an employee ID here, a special ID there. Instead of overloading the table with a bunch of columns, you want to have a normalized database. So one of the new features in Entity Framework 5, EF Core 5, is the ability to do this. To table, and I'm going to give it a name. I'll give it the name of Microsoft Contact. And I'll run it again. And once again, I want to emphasize I got the data that I needed, so I didn't have to change the rest of my application. Same query, same result. But behind the scenes, now if I refresh the database, notice now I have a Microsoft contact table. And it basically points to the contact and has the employee ID. And the contacts just has the contact's information. So now I have that flexibility to control what we call table per hierarchy, which is what the old behavior was, which is basically the entire hierarchy of classes are stored in a single table, versus table per type, where I can have a different table for each derived type. And Entity Framework will automatically make the same joins and generate the appropriate SQL to pull back the results that you're looking for. Let me close this out. And close database. Awesome. Let's take a look here. Yep, so I did entity to table. All right. So the next feature we're going to look at is events. And this is a fun feature. There's a few ways that you can hook into the Entity Framework pipeline. one way that we added is when I define the context up here, I can actually have it trigger an event when changes are saved. There's a saving changes, so you can do it, intercept it basically before it actually does the save. And there's a save changes, which is after. Now here I'm just using a Lambda expression. You'd probably want to actually use a method so you can hook it up and unregister it when it goes out of scope, etc. But basically what I'm doing is just saying save this many entities, and I'm showing the change tracker view. So just by plugging that event in, if I run this, and let's actually turn off logging so we have less noise, and run this. Now, if we look at what happened, we can see save 10 entities, and then it's showing me that status of the change tracker. And then saved one entity is when it actually added that meeting status and set that status to, hey, I'm going to join the meeting. So it fired twice. We had 2 changes, so we're looking good. Now, if adding just a method isn't reusable enough for you, maybe you have a pattern that you apply on multiple projects, there's another approach which is called an interceptor. And I'm going to show you a save changes interceptor first, and then I'll show you another type of interceptor that is even more fun. So if I come here, and I'm going to go inside of my definitions here and show you this interceptor. So this is a save changes interceptor. And let's go ahead and do control period to pull in the correct using statements. See how much we cleared up. We need threading, and we need threading task, threading, and then of course Alt-Shift-F to format the code. So what I've done is I've derived from a save changes interceptor. One of the changes we added to EF Core 6, EF Core 5 is in previous versions you had interfaces that you could use, but a lot of the baseline boilerplate was very similar, and there was a request to have a base class that you could just derive from and override based on what you need. So here I'm basically displaying some event data, and then I have 2 methods I overrode, save changes and saving changes async. So I don't necessarily know if there's going to be a synchronous or asynchronous implementation. See you, Michael. Thanks for the kind words. And so I'm going to implement both of these, but then I have the shared method it calls. Now you can do interesting things here, like set the cancellation token. You could write to logging. You can even manipulate results. I'll show that in a second. But let's do this one. Now, if I just define the interceptor, nothing interesting is going to happen. I have to configure it. So we'll go back to our configuration. This is where all our interesting things happen. And then we can say add interceptors. I'm just going to add a new saving changes implementation here. And so now that interceptor is registered. And when we run this, what we should see is a lot of yellow. So what we saw is we're actually firing 2. We're firing that event that I registered, and we're firing our new interceptor. And this is what I was expecting to show you earlier. When you have entities that don't have IDs assigned, Entity Framework assigns a unique ID that's a negative number that turns into the actual ID after it's been saved. So you can sort of see that result here. So this is the result of calling the interceptor. It's showing an ID, showing information. We're showing the change tracker status. This is the event that I hooked into. This is the interceptor. This is the event. So it's showing you two different approaches to solving the same problem. But we have more interceptors than just the data or the save changes interceptors. We also can intercept actual database commands. Now this might be interesting. For example, in our documentation, we have an example of providing query hints in the DB command. I decided to have a little bit more of a fun example that's completely contrived, is not recommended for production. And I'll show you why. So let me paste this in. So what I'm doing is I'm deriving from DB command interceptor. Let me just pull in system data common and format this. So while it's executing, I'm going to manipulate the command. So now I'm not triggering after the command ran, I'm triggering it right before it runs. Again, not recommended for production. This is super naive, but let's pretend like contact name is personally identifiable information. It's sensitive. We don't want people to be able to query it. So what I'm saying is if you have a select with a contact name, instead of pulling it from the database, just replace that with redacted as the name. Again, you can see why this is hacky. This is demo code, but it gives you an idea of what you can do in that pipeline. So again, running this now would do absolutely nothing because I need to register the interceptor. So let's see what I call it. I called it name interceptor. I'm very creative with my naming, so I always have to double check. New name interceptor. So we'll add that. We'll run this. Dun, dun, dun. And now notice that we got redacted. Now notice that the query that it thinks it's going to write is still pulling CNAME up here because we intercepted it at the DB command level, but now the contact names came back as redacted. So you have a lot of control over what happens with the SQL. The last thing that I want to show you, and then we'll open it up for general Q&A, is split queries, which this is a fun one. I need to open another project for that called split query. And someone asked about availability of the code. So I will check this repo in, but most of this is copied from our own documentation. I'm going to show you that as a last item before we go to questions. But basically what I did in this project is I created a ton of collections that are child properties of something called a host. So I have GUIDs, which just has a GUID string and it references back to a host. I have integers, which is just an integer cast to a string. I have some types. And then I have this host class right here that has a collection of GUIDs and some types. Now these are many-to-many relationships, so you can have a host that shares GUIDs between other hosts. And so there's a lot of joining between the tables. So I have a join table between host and GUID, host and int, host and type. And I think I create 10,000 of these integers and GUIDs. I grab all the types from the assembly. And then I create 50 hosts that have random sets of ints, GUIDs, and types. Now this is obviously contrived, but you can imagine in a production database, you might have orders, you might have order details that have products, that have SKUs, that have, so there's a lot of data sets that can be interrelated. And the problem comes when we do something like this. So up here, I'm just making sure my database is created and seeded, which takes a little bit of time. So I went ahead and did that before this call. And now I'm saying, give me all the hosts, include all the GUIDs, all the ints, all the types. So that's the simple query. Basically, give me the parent and include all the children. And then I'm writing what the query looks like and casting it to a list and giving you the count. So I'm going to hit F5 and let's see how this query runs. All projects are up to date. Here we go. Now notice that a couple things. First is this is my query right here, and it's basically doing a join to all the child tables, to the GUIDs, to the ints, to the types, because it's pulling back everything at once. We get a warning from Entity Framework Core that compiling a query which loads related collections for more than one collection can cause slow query performance, blah, blah, blah. Let me just point out the whole time I've been talking, it still has not pulled back a result. Now this is SQLite, so I'm sure SQL Server would handle this a lot more, but I'm having a major performance issue here. I'm just going to go ahead and stop this because I have no clue how long it would actually take to resolve. So what split query does is it says, you know what, for certain types of queries, it makes sense to go ahead and pull back the sub collection separately. Now, if you think about it, in this case, I have overlap. The same hosts share different sets of GUIDs. So instead of pulling back multiple copies of those, it probably makes sense just to get my collection of GUIDs, my ints, my types, and to join those together afterwards. So I'm just adding this extension to the query as split query. It's the only change I'm going to make. I'm going to hit F5, and let's see what happens now. Dun, dun, dun. So what happened from the database command perspective is now we have multiple commands. It pulls the hosts, it pulls the GUIDs, pulls the ints, and it pulls the types. And hopefully in a much shorter period of time, we get the results. So notice how much faster that was. Like I was still talking on the previous example, it hadn't pulled back. I've let it run. I have no clue how long it will take. This one actually got results back. Another interesting thing though, just so you know, with split query, is when I did to query string, it's just showing me select hosts. Yes, this is an EF Core 5 feature only. This warning comes through the logs and says it's being executed in split query mode. The SQL shown is for the first query. Additional may also be executed. The reason why it does this is because there are optimizations done as the query is being mapped to SQL. And at the time you're evaluating, it doesn't necessarily know what those optimizations are. The other thing to note is this can have side effects because we're making multiple calls to collections, and so collections can be modified in between calls. So there can be consistency issues, and there is a warning for that in the documentation. It's nuanced and it's not something that can happen all the time, but because of the potential side effects, this is why we don't do this automatically. We make it an option for you to choose based on what makes sense for your application. So let me just pop out here because I want to show you one more thing. So that is sort of a run through the features I wanted to show you. I do want to pop over and show you that on our documentation, it's really easy to get to. You go to docs.microsoft.com/EF. The language will be added there for you. So that's how you get it. You could also do aka.ms efdocs is probably the easiest to remember. Takes you to our documentation. But if you go into the documentation and expand the table of contents, we have this releases and planning, EF Core 5, high level plan. This is the list of all of the new features. Now the team has made a commitment to be as backwards compatible as humanly possible. We made some decisions in previous releases to break because we had to rebuild certain aspects of it. Moving forward, we're striving for that. Having said that, we do get some breaking changes. All of those are documented on this breaking changes. So that's the first thing. All of these examples, all of this documentation has been updated. So for example, if I come to table per type, it'll tell me it's tracked, but if I go through like logging, simple logging, that log2 that I talked about, all of this information is going to be here. Most of these come with samples that you can actually pull down from GitHub. So that's one thing to look at. The next that's important to note is this is our GitHub repo. It is an open source project. We get hundreds of community contributions. So we are so thankful to the community for helping us with this project. The team is 6 people and probably over time 1,000 plus community members, right, contributing to that. But if you go into the issues, there are 2 pinned issues. One is a weekly status update. So the team is 100% transparent with exactly what the plan is, where we're at, what we're doing. We talk about what's happened in the previous week. This is actually an old one. You just control N to drop to the bottom. We also call out community contributions. So every update acknowledges those contributions that came in. And the other thing you'll notice is this pinned issue for our community stand-up. So we have a bi-weekly stand-up that we're taking a pause for the holidays, but it'll come back January 16th. But you can use this tab on the issues to suggest guests, products, demos, etc. We have a playlist you can go to and see these. And of course, we have the repos and samples. So having said that, that is a lot of talking and a lot of code. I actually did have one more slide in my deck. I'm so excited to get back to it. And this is, I spent so much time on this, so hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as I did. I'm just kidding. It's actually just these links I just showed you. So are there questions for me or anything you would like me to review as we have a few moments left, I believe. So this is over in 15 minutes, is that right? Did I stay?
You can go on for as long as you want. I think we are
I may be
schedule.
talking to myself eventually, but yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So let's see if there's anyone has questions or wants to look at anything.
Yeah, so you did not go into migrations on this one. Is there anything new with migrations as far as EF Core?
There are, and too many for me to actually pull off the top of my head, but let's come back here and go to blah, 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 blah. Any framework core releases and planning. Because I want to make sure I'm talking about what was new with, oh yeah, look, what's new. And then if we look at migrations, actually it's easier. This is like detailed by preview that came out. This one is migrations and deployment experience. So basically, does this summarize everything? We've been making a lot of effort. So the biggest change that we want to make for migrations is to make it easier for people who are, which is most production applications in distributed environments, right? So there's a lot of people who spin up migrations when the application starts. But if you have an application running on 15 nodes, whether it's a ASP.NET web app behind a load balancer, or it's running on a pod in a Kubernetes cluster, right? It's not the best experience. So what we've done with EF Core 6 is provided things like idempotent scripts and some other ways of generating what you need to plug into your CI/CD pipeline to be able to apply a script at a set point in time and to work with that migration. In EF Core 6, though, we're focused on this concept that we call bundles, which is a executable generated specifically for the migration. So with the bundle, you can have an artifact that you basically just plug into your pipeline and run, and it succeeds or fails. If it failed, it'll give you logging information, etc. But it will manage from a code perspective, looking at the database model and the migration setup and actually applying the changes for you. So that's a major thing. But if you look at this link here, this summarizes based on the issues, SQLite table reviews, transaction support, connection string on the command line, idempotent script. So those are the main things that came in EF Core 5. There is a question in chat, is EF Core supported in Blazor WASM? So the answer is yes, you can pull in EF Core, you can run it in Blazor WASM. The problem is, if you want to connect to SQL Server, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, IBM DB2, SQLite, etc., none of those have protocols that support HTTP to access them directly. So you're inside the browser sandbox. So it doesn't make sense to connect to SQL Server because the browser won't allow you. It's not an EF Core limitation. What you can do is you could connect to Cosmos DB. There is a HTTP interface for Cosmos. The caveat with that is you never want secrets to be stored in a browser. So the only really secure way to do it is you would use something like Active Directory authentication, Azure Active Directory. You would use that security context to get a token, and then you would use that token to access Cosmos DB. So that could be done. Whether it makes sense over writing a web API and just calling a server is up to the user to decide. There's a company called Uno who has a platform similar to Blazor. They're about using XAML in the browser. And they've implemented a SQLite that runs inside the browser. And so you can use the Entity Framework Core SQLite driver to interface with that and actually have local storage inside the browser. I haven't worked with that directly, but it is possible. There's a question, new migration model. Do you still get the migrations folder? Yes, right now you do get the migrations folder. Cool. Any other questions? The only thing I'll add as sort of a side note, we ran a survey and we're overwhelmed with the response. There were about 4,000 people who responded, and everyone had a unique opinion about Entity Framework. But the great news from that survey is that we got so much valuable information that we're using it to plan our Entity Framework Core 6 release. And in the past, the main signal was like issue upvotes and the GitHub repo. This is another signal where people were able to articulate more of the types of features they wanted, and we were able to look at things. We will have a stand-up episode where we review sort of the results of the survey. There's some interesting things, like you'd be amazed how many people are still on a pre-Entity Framework 6 version of Entity Framework for various reasons. Another thing is, I'm going to ask whoever has a mic on, what do you think the most requested provider, so what database we don't support is the most requested database people would like us to support? And you can try to pick the number 1 or 2 slot.
Redis?
We've got Redis. We have Excel in the chat.
Mongo.
Mongo. So the number 1 requested was MongoDB. The number 2 requested was Excel and CSV. So now my job as a program manager is to understand, when you say you want Excel support, are you really saying you want a CRUD and concurrency on an Excel spreadsheet, or do you really just want to be able to use LINQ to query a spreadsheet, right? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing. But it is interesting. There's a lot of questions around the Cosmos DB provider. And it turns out a lot of people like the idea of a consistent API and way to set up their data access. So even though Cosmos is non-structured and SQL is relational, the idea that there's a consistent way to interface with both of them is actually a popular concept with a lot of people, which was surprising, but is an indicator that we should at least seriously look at supporting more non-structured databases, for example.
Does it only support Cosmos SQL API right now? Is that?
Yeah, so the API is pretty much abstracted from you. So you're just using like a link query and the SDK is translating it. But yeah, it's using the SQL API behind the scenes. That's the reason why we picked that API, is because we already have so much infrastructure for translating link to SQL query that it was more straightforward to build that provider and that interface. It still wasn't as easy as just adding the client SDK and flipping a switch. It was some work, but it was a more direct path. So cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, just is there upgrading going from 3.1 to 5? Is there any special tips or tricks to do that, or is it just upgrading the NuGet package and just seeing what works and what doesn't in your project?
Yeah, so validation is typically the biggest big challenge, right? How do I validate that it works? So there's no like conversion or process. The key to converting is to really start with the doc that I showed you with breaking changes. And they're really, I mean, it looks like a big list, but a lot of them are really edge items. Let me pull this open. So most people report, and I'd be interested to see if anyone has a different experience on this call. Most people report they swapped out to the new package and it just worked. But you can reference this and look at some of these specific items. So it's enough to fit on a page of, you know, what might be a breaking change and where to look. So fortunately for people who have a pretty comprehensive test suite, then it's a pretty, you know, it's you swap out the package, run the test suite, maybe test some edge cases and go for it. But there's no major, like you have to rewrite or restructure your project in a certain way. For example, what I was trying to show with the mini to mini is I was able to go from having a link table to not having a link table to having an implicit link table without changing any of my other code. I changed the configuration and that changed the implementation, but it didn't change how I wrote my queries or how I did a lot of other things with the code. So,
Jeremy, I have a question, but I don't know if it's necessarily EF Core related, but do you notice any kind of performance difference between table per type versus table per hierarchy?
That's a great question. I haven't looked into the performance considerations for that. Yeah, that'd be interesting. I think it would depend on kind of how wide your data is. In other words, if you have a lot of overloads coming from a fat table that you're throwing away, columns that you don't need, versus you have a really deep join structure. But I think for the most part, I wouldn't think it would make a major difference. But those are also famous last words, right?
Oh, I know. We have a table per type, and we have nested query. It's just that you look at the query that gets generated, the SQL. Oh, it's just heinous. It really is. And so I'm actually flattening a lot of this out. We're going to have data duplication, but the query performance is killing us.
So this is EF Core 5?
No, this is actually EF Classic.
Okay, I got you.
And we can't.
It'd be interesting to see. I mean, we have a team member, Smith, who his main focus for a long time has been query and doing everything possible to optimize that pipeline and the SQL generated. So I'd be interested, and that's something we might even look at as a team.
Well, when you said that as split query, see, that would really help, because we're having and I've been tasked to improve performance, and it's like little baby gains here and there. So yeah, we're having a lot of query timeouts.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. No worries.
Cool. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share. Look at all those extra bits we have back on the video. Is just so much clearer now.
If anyone wants help with playing with snapshot testing and Entity Framework or SQL, feel free to ping me. I'm Simon Kropp on Twitter as well. So
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for offering that.
Yeah.
what's
Yeah,
the
so-
status of DTC against SQL and .NET Core? That's one of the things that bit us when we moved over to .NET Core and Entity Framework Core, the fact that DTC wasn't supported.
Yes, so that is something that's more in the SQL client than the Entity Framework Core provider implementation. And I know it's something that is very requested. I don't know the status on the implementation. I don't think it's there yet, but I haven't followed that recently.
Okay. Just a heads up to anyone who's moving over that into that scenario. Often you won't necessarily hit DTC escalation unless you're under certain circumstances. So it can be something that bites you in production at runtime rather than, debugging locally and testing.
Oh,
But yeah, it's always fun. You make all these architectural changes and upgrade. Are you just laughing at my dog, are you?
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not laughing at you.
Come on.
It's like, give me some attention, please.
Well, I'm talking and there's no one else here, so I must be talking to him, right?
Hey, Simon, are you really in Canberra?
Yeah.
Nice. I was looking outside. I'm like, it looks awfully daylight. And I just followed you on Twitter. I'm like, I was in Melbourne 3 years ago. Love it.
Yeah, I follow Jeremy on Twitter, so I saw this come up. I'm like, that's actually a pretty convenient time for me. I'm working from home and basically
Nice.
do it over my lunch hour.
Nice.
Very good.
Well, what did somebody tell me today? It's whiskey time. It's something like that. So every time is whiskey time.
Somewhere in the
Yeah,
world.
so actually, I was going to start this meeting off with a happy hour, happy half hour, and then get going into the meeting, but I completely screwed up the calendar. Thanks. Thanks,
Well,
everything being online. So,
Well, I was going to say this is one of the benefits of doing this remote. I mean, I do miss the getting in person and having a few beers after the meetup, but it is so nice to be able to get people like Jeremy and Simon that can actually join from halfway around. This is one of the I'll say bennies, but you know what I mean. One of the good things that have come out of COVID. And us all, I mean, I've been working from home for 10 years, but I mean, being able to do this and meet y'all. I mean, I knew who Jeremy was, but I literally went to the Atlanta meetup online and said, hey, would you mind presenting in Orlando? He's like, I'd love to. I'm like, that's very cool. And thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So what's
All right.
next, Jeremy? Is there any kind of like conference, anything that you're speaking at, or what's next?
I haven't been as good as keeping my blog up to date with upcoming. I don't have anything major coming up. I've had a lot going on at the end of this year, so I sort of wound that down and said, you know what, I'll do some user groups and some meetups, and certainly there's some countries that just don't typically get speakers in their area, so being able to do it virtually, I've been focused on that. But I think my next talk that I have scheduled, if I remember correctly, is for Microsoft Reactor. It's like a student-focused talk on what's new with Entity Framework 5. So
Nice.
yeah, it seems like that is the most common request, is to get a presentation on the new features for that. And then I've got a few .NET for Spark, but I haven't signed up to an NDC or VS Live. I don't know if they're doing online things or whatnot. So I've been focused really on user groups and like I said, some of the conferences in underserved countries.
Yeah, I think those conferences are switched to doing like half-day workshops instead of talks. And it's kind of if you're into that kind of stuff, it's good. But I'm not into giving half-day workshops. I really don't have the time or the patience to prep for that, and especially so I do enough of that at work anyway. So I don't, I give talks to get away from work, and then if I'm going and doing half-day workshops, to people in other countries,
a lot of work.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to. But yeah, that I've kind of slowed down on conferences too because of that.
Sure.
So .NET for Spark, tell me about that. It's is that like the HD inside Sparks, or is that the type of engine that you're using developing
Yeah,
.NET?
so Spark has a core open source engine, and then there's services that are on top of that. And out of the box, it ships with Scala and Python, Scala, Python, and Spark SQL. And so .NET for Spark extends that core. So it's not a fork of Spark. It's actually built on the open source Spark. So it'll run anywhere Spark runs. That's Databricks, HD Insight. The challenge with Databricks is that certain hosts don't include .NET Core as part of the default implementation, but you can package .NET Core with the app. But the idea is really to expose the APIs that are available in Spark from .NET so that it makes it accessible to .NET developers. We're certainly not trying to tell Python developers that they should learn C# and switch. We're looking at C#, F# developers who want to take advantage of big data, give them all the access. It performs just as well as the other languages, and then also to be able to pull in existing libraries. It actually was born as an internal project at Microsoft, where some teams in Microsoft wanted to be able to leverage existing .NET libraries with Spark. And so this enables you to pull those libraries in and make them part of the jobs that you submit.
So basically, like in Jupyter notebooks, you run .NET code on Databricks. Is that what the end product looks like?
It's a couple different things. So you can use it in notebooks, and with notebooks, you basically pull in a reference to Microsoft.Spark, spin up a Spark section. If it's a Jupyter notebook, .NET Interactive, Synapse Online supports this as well. It's actually what I use for a lot of my mining for surveys. So that's the interactive aspect, which is the real time, which is great for me if I'm hacking a survey and if I say, it'd be interesting, the people who answered that they're not really knowledgeable about databases, how does that change their technology choices versus, things like that. But the more traditional model is you build a project, you create a console app. Console app has inputs and outputs, and then you submit that as a job to the Spark server. So I might have like an ETL process that is a massive amount of data that I'm aggregating or cleansing or modifying. And so I would write the application to do that, submit that to a Spark cluster, whether it's HD Insight, whether it's directly to Spark, whether it's Databricks, whether it's Synapse, and then that job will run maybe on a schedule, maybe not, because they're streaming in batch. And that's by far the most common use is through submitting these jobs that run, but it's increasing popularity being able to do the interactive notebook thing for that. And then we're looking at things coming down the pipeline, like there's ML.NET. And so you can pull ML.NET into a .NET for Spark project, but ML.NET has one representation of the data. Spark has a different, called a data frame versus a data view. And so one of the things we're looking at is how can we make those truly shared so the libraries basically complement each other better. So
do you have any talks on that?
I do. I've given a few talks on .NET for Spark. Actually, I did one for Sri Lanka recently, and I basically pulled down the ASP.NET docs repo and pulled in the metadata from that. So like the title and the words, and then showed interactively how I could do word counts and then clustering and then figuring out which words are important for a document, and then automatically categorizing documents based on the way the words cluster. So it's been a learning experience for me. I avoided ML and big data. I said I have too many things that I'm focused on. I don't need that. And then I ended up PM .NET for Spark. And I said, you know what? I should probably learn more about this so I can say words like k-norm clustering and actually understand what that means. So
Santosh, I think we need to pull him into our next code camp for that.
Yeah, definitely. Why do you think I asked the question? I mean,
good segue, man. Good segue.
This is a recruiting interview.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, cool. Well, I am going to hear the sounds of my wife getting ready for dinner, so I'm going to go help her with that. And because it's getting to be that time here, I haven't eaten yet, so I'm going to roll off pretty soon. But
thank you very much.
Thanks again for the invitation, and definitely happy to do this again and work with you on other projects too. So.